committees. Daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable Member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition signed by 42 residents from Clare. This is a petition aimed at having the Department of Transportation to assess the poor condition of the Harrington Road and take the necessary measures to fix the problems. And I have fixed my name to it, Mr. Speaker.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table a petition, and the operative clause is for a better Grand Myra South Road. It is signed by 377 individuals, and I've attached my name as per the rules of the House.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the 12 residents of the Old Coach Road, I would like to take this opportunity to table this petition requesting paving of this road in Goodwood. Mr. Speaker, I have affixed my name to the petition.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Minister of the Voluntary Sector, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers from Nova Scotia devoted 207 hours on average to volunteer work in 2010, the highest average in Canada, and whereas many community groups and organizations in our province would not be able to continue their work without the commitment and dedication of volunteers, and whereas today, at our 38th Annual Provincial Volunteer Awards ceremony, the provincial government recognized 69 outstanding volunteers who have a common desire to make a difference in their community by giving their time and talents to improving the lives of others. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House acknowledge the significant contribution that Nova Scotia's volunteers make to their community and congratulate the 69 volunteers who have received the 2012 Provincial Volunteer Award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability that affects girls and boys around the world, and whereas every year autism organizations celebrate Autism Awareness Day on April the 2nd, and use this day to spread awareness of autism spectrum disorder and the impact it has on children, families, and communities. And whereas, according to Autism Nova Scotia, an organization that helps children, families, and communities living with autism, 1 in every 110 Nova Scotians have autism spectrum disorder. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize April 2nd as World Autism Awareness Day and congratulate the dedication of Autism Nova Scotia and other autism support groups in our province for the valuable services they provide. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Bill number 5, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Fair Treatment of Children.
Here. The Honourable Member for Hants West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Provide for the Fair Treatment of Children.
Bill number 6, entitled An Act to Provide for the Fair Treatment of Children.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would also beg leave to introduce an act entitled An Act to Promote Education Respecting Concussion in Sports.
The Honourable Member for Hants West begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Promote Education Respecting Concussions in Sports.
Bill number 7, entitled An Act to Promote Education Respecting Concussion in Sports.
Order the bill be read a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers provide immeasurable benefits to their communities and our province by putting their minds, hands, and most importantly their hearts at the service of others. And whereas earlier today, individuals and organizations from across Nova Scotia were honoured for their generosity at the 38th Annual Provincial Volunteers Award held in Halifax. And whereas their dedication, support, and true desire to make a difference in both their communities and in the lives of others is what makes our province so great. Therefore, it be it resolved the members of the legislature congratulate the individuals and organizations recognized at today's 38th Annual Provincial Volunteers Awards and extend our appreciation for the difference they make in the lives of others. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice, and on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas, in early February, Nova Scotians and all Canadians lost a loyal public servant with the passing of Senator Fred Dixon. And whereas Senator Dixon was a respected lawyer, an expert in offshore resources, and a tireless promoter of Nova Scotia's energy interests. And whereas since 2008, Senator Dixon served in the Senate of Canada, where his advocacy for and on behalf of Nova Scotians was most notable. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House express sincere condolences to the family and friends of Senator Dixon and pause to remember the many important contributions that he has made to our province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion carried. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 2nd marks World Autism Awareness Day, and whereas the NDP government has shown Nova Scotians that public education, especially special needs education, is not a priority by slashing public education funding by $65 million in the last 2 years, and whereas parents are rightfully worried about cuts to teachers, education assistance, and special needs services and resources as a result of the NDP government's actions. Therefore, be it resolved that the NDP government and the Minister of Education education commit on this World Autism Awareness Day to reinstate funding to public education, to invest in special needs resources, and to provide real support to children and families living with autism. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers are a source of fresh ideas and energy, and their efforts can expand an organization's capacity. And whereas David Schufeld from the municipality of Argyll is a dedicated and loyal volunteer who gets things done, such as organizing a fundraising drive in 2007, which raised $12,000 for repairs to a local church roof, and being the co-chair of the April Hubbard fundraiser, which raised $55,000 in 2011. And whereas Mr. Schufelt also coaches minor hockey and baseball and is serving his second term as Grand Knight of Knights of Columbus 8988. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud the significant volunteer contributions of David Schufelt and congratulate him for being recognized by the municipality of Argyll as their 2012 Volunteer of the Year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the community of Bridgetown has been selected as the 2012 Model Volunteer Community of the Year by the Provincial Volunteer Week Awards Committee in recognition of its support for volunteers and its impressive number of community accomplishments. And whereas through cooperation, commitment, and desire to enhance the lives of its residents, projects such as a new library, a new fire hall, a new playground at Jubilee Park, a new ice plant for the curling rink, a Bridgetown Area Sports Hall of Fame, the Bridgetown Area Community Fund, and the Bridgetown Area Youth Ambassador Program came into fruition. And whereas these projects serve to foster community spirit and pride in the town, and has successfully attracted many newcomers as a result of its community resources and its positive can-do attitude, therefore be it resolved the members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Steve Rafferty, Community Development Coordinator for Bridgetown Area, and the incredible group of volunteers that give up their time and talents to make their community a better place to live and to work. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Jessie McNeil, daughter of John and Teresa McNeil from Sydney River, is about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime. And whereas in July, Jessie will be heading overseas on the first leg of a mission trip with the World Race Program that will see her living and working in 11 countries over an 11-month period. And whereas Jessie is a Cape Breton University student who will graduate this spring with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communication and Psychology, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Jessie McNeil and wish her all the best of luck in the wonderful experience she's about to partake in. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read this resolution on behalf of the member for Dartmouth East. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh Award was founded in 1956 and came to Canada in 1963 and is now present in 126 countries. And whereas the award encourages young people to become active and engaged citizens in the area of community services and challenges them to develop personal skills, physical activity, and learn what it means to exemplify leadership. And whereas Andrew Fury, a resident of Dartmouth East, has received a Silver Duke of Edinburgh Award for the quarter from July to December 2011. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Andrew on receiving this prestigious award and offer best wishes for continued success as a leader in our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Donald McEachran joined the Port Hood Fire Department 50 years ago and in 1980 became their longest-serving chief. And whereas today Donald still takes enormous pride in the maintenance of the fire hall, doing whatever it takes to keep it in top shape. And whereas in addition to the fire department, Mr. McEachran also volunteers with the Chestico Days Parade, the Port Hood Planning Committees, and speaks to children whenever he can about fire prevention. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize Donald McEachran for being named Outstanding Volunteer by the Municipality of the County of Inverness for 2012. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 2nd was designated by the United Nations 5 years ago as World Autism Day, and whereas World Autism Day promotes greater understanding of autism and strives to develop positive perceptions about the remarkable people living with this pervasive disorder. And whereas for the second year, Home Depots across Canada have been participating in the Light It Up Blue initiative, where blue light bulbs are sold to fund research, advocacy, and community supports for persons with autism, while buildings and homes can shine a light on autism. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the legislature acknowledge today, April 2nd, as World Autism Day and strive to ensure that adequate early interventions as well as supports in school and in the community are available to ensure the unique talents and skills of persons with autism are fully realized. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Amy Gordon of Sydney Mines, representing Cape Breton Island on the Nova Scotia team, had her second Special Olympics Canada Winter Games. And whereas Amy participated in speed skating, and her sponsor, Haley Street Adult Service Centre and Resicare, are thrilled that she was chosen to be on the Nova Scotia team. And whereas Amy and approximately 700 participants converged on St. Albert, Alberta for the Special Olympics Canada Winter Games, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Amy for her success at the Games and her many great memories of this event. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville, on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to rise tonight to introduce a Girl Guide unit from the Sackville area. And so what I'll do is ask the guides themselves to rise when I say your name. And so we have Lauren Geiser, Emma Murphy, and Megan McNeil. If you guys can stand and receive the warm welcome of the House with their leaders, Sarah Bent, Natasha Juntermans, Susan McKenzie, and Wendy Murphy. They're from the 5th Carter Unit of Guides in the Sackville area. So I ask the House to give them a warm welcome.
The honourable member for Clare.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers are the backbone of every community in Nova Scotia, and the people of Clare are proud of the many dedicated individuals who give of themselves each day to make our municipality a better place to live. And whereas this year the Clare community has selected one of its outstanding citizens as Volunteer of the Year, and this individual has given much in the way of time and energy to various organizations. And whereas through this individual's genuine warmth and caring towards others, she has become a valuable asset to the organization that she has been involved in. Therefore, it be resolved that members of this House of Assembly congratulate Joan Tufts of Sonyville for being named Clare's Volunteer of the Year for her outstanding contribution to her community. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 44% of Nova Scotia seniors volunteer by giving their time and talents to their communities. And whereas Lyman Lytle of Ellers House embodies the true spirit of volunteerism as he assisted for the past 15 years with the Ellers House Community Hall Association. As a member of the Oak Hill Cemetery Committee and serving as a church elder with the St. Louis Church for more than 40 years and serving as janitor of the church for 51 years. And whereas Lyman first began singing in the church choir when he was 14 years old and today remains a committed supporter of the Canadian Red Cross and Canadian Blood Services, having donated blood more than 60 times. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud Lyman Lytle of Ellers House for volunteer work above and beyond the call of duty and congratulate him for being recognized by the municipality of West Hants as their 2012 Volunteer of the Year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kathy Gray was born and brought up in Windsor, Nova Scotia, married the boy next door, Glenn Gray, and together they had 4 children. Whereas her husband heeded the call for the ministry, and she moved with him to various charges, and in each case, together they renovated, improved, or enlarged each church until they built a new church in Westfall, Nova Scotia, called the New Beginnings Ministries. Where she, along with her husband, formed cell groups, TLC groups, drama groups, and started or supported Sunday schools in each area where they worked. And when the new church was built, she became choir director and formed one of the best choirs in all of Nova Scotia. Therefore, be resolved that members of this House recognize and acknowledge the dedication and many contributions Kathy Gray has made for her community and for Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Denise Sampson from the town of Port Hawkesbury volunteers her time and talents with the Port Hawkesbury Highland Dance Association and has served as co-chair for the Festival of the Strait for the past 5 years. And whereas Denise is one of the first to step up to the plate when someone is in need, saying she wants to be a positive role model for her daughter and be part of her activities. Whereas it is people like Denise Sampson who keep our communities vibrant. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the significant volunteer commitment of Denise Sampson in being named the 2012 Volunteer of the Year by the town of Port Hawkesbury. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Baker's Journal, a national magazine based out of Ontario, featured an ultimate pie contest, and whereas the Masstown Market in Colchester North, one of the 3 finalists, was chosen as winner over the Toronto and Vancouver-based runners-up. And whereas the pie, which was chosen because of its crust, its filling, and its balance of flavor, including haddock, cod, scallops, shrimp, cream cheese, cheddar cheese, red peppers, potato, corn, and undisclosed spices. Therefore, be it resolved, I'll get you some. All the members of the House of Assembly congratulate Chef Megan Anatole, Fish Market Manager Mike Desaulnier, and Masstown Market owner-operator Laurie Jennings for winning this national competition and for bringing recognition to Masstown Market, Colchester North, and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Sydney Mines native Arlene Baxendale was among one of the first 6 civilians to be awarded the Alberta Emergency Services Medal for years of service supporting emergency management in Alberta. And whereas Ms. Baxendale is an instructor for the Canadian Emergency Management College in Ottawa, an instructor in emergency management for Northern Alberta's Institute of Technology, and also teaches foundations to community development at Rocky Mountain College in Calgary. And whereas Arlene has been involved with emergency management for the last 24 years, and she works corporately looking after emergency response plans and running emergencies in the fields. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in congratulating Arlene Baxendale on receiving this groundbreaking award. Thank her for her many years of public service and wish her continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Charles Edward Aiken was an extraordinary individual who always brightened any room he entered with his dazzling smile and can-do attitude, and whereas Ed was a consummate salesman running his own sales and marketing firm, and a valued volunteer serving on a variety of organizations, including the IWK Kermesse and Celebrate Canada, and was especially active volunteering for federal and provincial Liberal Party candidates. And whereas on Saturday, March 10th, 2012, Ed lost his 10-year battle with a very rare form of cancer, chordoma, leaving his many friends and family to mourn the loss of a real gentleman, a true and valued friend. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House send their condolences to Ed's family, including the love of his life, his wife Marie, and his siblings Audrey Hall, Janet Harris, and Jim Aiken, and their families, and wish them Godspeed. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas based on the latest statistical information, Nova Scotians on average donate 207 hours to volunteer work on an annual basis, the highest average in Canada. And whereas based on her community involvement, Michelle Symes from the municipality of Victoria County would have to be at least one of the Nova Scotians contributing 207 or more volunteer hours per year based on her work with the Ross Ferry Fire Department, where she has consistently arranged and conducted training sessions for the department on a wide variety of topics. And whereas Michelle also volunteers at the Atlantic Burn Camp and is a member of the parent support group at Bulledry Elementary School, while also taking time this past year to volunteer for County Colours. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the significant volunteer commitment put forth by Michelle Symes in being named 2012 Volunteer of the Year by the Municipality of Victoria County, and wish her and her family the very best in all their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas while Canada celebrates Queen Elizabeth's Diamond Jubilee, medals are being awarded to Canadians who have made significant contributions and achievements. And whereas Yarmouth resident 9-year-old Bryden Hutt was presented the Diamond Jubilee Medal by the Prime Minister and Governor General for his continued efforts to raise money for the Children's Wish Foundation at a ceremony at Rideau Hall on February 6, 2012. And whereas Bryden, a grade 3 student at Meadowfields Community School and Canada's youngest recipient in February, has a rare immune deficiency known as Omnin syndrome and was granted his own wish in 2008, a trip to Disney World. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate 9-year-old Bryden Hutt for receiving this prestigious honor and recognize him for giving so much to his community and beyond. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future date. I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on January 24, 2012, the Knights of Columbus Council 8988 presented a check for $5,000 for the St. Anne's Parish Building Fund. And whereas 2 of the church steeples had to be repaired at an estimated cost of $64,000. And whereas the Knights of Columbus organized a lottery to help raise funds towards the repairs. And therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank the Knights of Columbus for organizing this lottery and thank them for their efforts to help maintain the integrity of the structure of St. Anne's Church, the oldest Acadian parish of the region. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Carol and Evelyn Palmer of Harmony Kings County continue to travel across this country promoting farm safety like they have now for the past 32 years. And whereas Carol and Evelyn Palmer have played key roles in the creation of provincial and national Farmers with Disabilities associations, and whereas the Palmers have taken part in Canada Agricultural Safety Week from March the 11th to March 17, 2012, where the campaign's 3-year theme is Planned Farm Safety. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize Carol and Evelyn Palmer of Harmony, Kings County, for their continued leadership in promoting farm safety all across Canada. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cyril MacDonald from Albert Bridge was recently elected to the Student Representative Council as a member for the Shannon School of Business. And whereas Cyril is the son of Abe MacDonald and Brenda Williamson, and whereas Cyril MacDonald is an active student at the University of Cape Breton University, therefore be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Cyril MacDonald and wish him very best in his future endeavours. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the general rate on power has increased by 38% since 2001, and whereas the NDP added a tax on every power bill in the province, which will amount to an extra $53 next year. Nova Scotians are struggling to keep up with ever-increasing power rates under this NDP government. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly remind the Premier that Nova Scotians cannot afford these high increases in the price of power, and that the Premier's continued inaction is making life very expensive for all Nova Scotians. They called it a better deal for all families. Thank you.
Motion is tabled. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Captain Richard Smith of Windsor is one of 453,000 volunteers in Nova Scotia who contribute $1.8 billion worth of services to the province's economy. And whereas Richard joined the Windsor Fire Department in 1991 and by 1993 received the Outstanding Achievement Award from the Windsor Fire Department Veterans Association for his work in promoting fire prevention, and was recognized again by the Veterans Association in 2007 for his work in training firefighters in rescue boat operations. And whereas in addition to the fire department, Richard is a survivor of prostate cancer and one of the many who supports the Canadian Cancer Society Relay for Life campaign and serves on the Town of Windsor's Police Advisory Committee. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Captain Richard Smith for being recognized by the Town of Windsor for his outstanding volunteer work and wish him continued success. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the owners and staff of Imagine Salon and Spa of Bedford determined last year that they wanted to raise money to combat breast cancer. And whereas the salon raised money by holding bake sales, gift basket draws, and producing and selling a calendar developed by the salon featuring 16 women and 1 man, all survivors of breast cancer. And whereas the salon reached its goal on February 26, 2012, when staff, clients, friends, family, and breast cancer survivors all gathered at Imagine to celebrate the donation of $10,000 to CIBC Run for the Cure, Breast Cancer Action Nova Scotia, and Dalhousie Medical Research. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Imagine Salon owners Ian Mark Smith and Jacqueline Smith and all of their staff for comforting and encouraging breast cancer survivors while generating funds for research. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Adamby Badek Bobcats won a silver medal at the provincial qualifying tournament in Shetticamp in February, and whereas the Badek team was seeded 5th in the league standings and faced an uphill battle from the start but defeated Shetticamp, Port Hood, and New Waterford to capture silver against all odds. And whereas as a result of their success at the provincial qualifying tournament, the Bobcats will advance to the regionals. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Badek Bobcat players Joshua McDonald, Jessica McLean, Kiana Pira, Bauer Matson, Ben McKenzie, Carson Buchanan, Josh Bennett, Mackenzie LeBlanc, Drew LeBlanc, Kenzie McFarlane, Robert Burke, Zachary Bennett, and Michael Cameron, and the coaches Sheldon Matheson, Edward Cameron, Lawrence Bennett, and Jason LeBlanc, and wish them the best in the regions. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I read this resolution on behalf of my colleague from Dartmouth East. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Duke of Edinburgh Award was founded in 1956 and came to Canada in 1963 and is now present in 126 countries. And whereas the award encourages young people to become active and engaged citizens in the area of community service and challenges them to develop personal skills and physical activity and learn what it means to exemplify leadership. And whereas Evan Ford, a resident of Dartmouth, has received a Silver Duke of Edinburgh Award for the quarter from July to December 2011. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Evan on receiving this prestigious award and offer best wishes for continued success as leaders in our community. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Shift Home in Yarmouth has been a safe haven to many homeless youth, giving them a safe place to stay and access necessary services. Whereas Shift will no longer be able to provide supportive housing to troubled youth as of March 31st without funding from the Department of Community Services, Justice, or Health. And whereas despite calls from the community staff and residents past and present to fund Shift House, the Minister of Community Services still refuses to provide that funding. Therefore, it be it resolved that this NDP government funds Shift so that they can continue to support youth in keeping a roof over their heads and help them in reaching their full potential. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. The motion is tabled. I hear several noes. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues for that wonderful welcome here this evening. Thank you. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas from March 22nd to March 25th, 2012, the 23rd annual Vince Ryan Memorial Scholarship Hockey Tournament was hosted in my great community of Glace Bay and across many rinks in Cape Breton. And whereas the tournament hosted over 130 men's and women's teams from across the province, country, and continent, bringing thousands of hockey players and visitors to our island and leaving a lasting legacy, cultural and economic impact on our communities and region. And whereas the annual tournament has generated close to $300,000 in its 23-year history, providing scholarships in the amount of $1,000 to all high schools in Cape Breton. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Catherine Ryan and the Ryan family, tournament organizer Mr. Rich Warren, and the hundreds of volunteers who dedicate themselves to making the Vince Ryan into one of the largest adult hockey tournaments in the world. And we look forward to the 24th edition of this legendary hockey celebration. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day, government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call address and reply to the speech from the throne?
Address and reply and speech from the throne. The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise this evening as the member for Richmond and to share a few comments regarding the Speech from the Throne 2012 edition. This is the third edition that we've been given the pleasure of being entertained with. It's the fourth. Well, look at that. It's how time flies by. There was 2 in 1 year. So we're up to number 4, which is interesting, Mr. Speaker, because I've said this a few times for those members who might not have heard me say that, but the NDP has spent its entire existence in opposition prior to the last provincial election. So one would have thought they clearly had time on their hands to develop a vision and a plan of where they want to bring Nova Scotia. But here we are, the 4th edition of the Speech from the Throne, and we've yet to hit the 3rd anniversary of this government's first mandate from the July 09 provincial election. It was June, was it? Okay. I'll speak a bit about elections and why I might get confused at times as I go on, Mr. Speaker, and I'll have the chance to get a bit more into some of the areas of the Speech from the Throne. But I first, as is customary, want to recognize Her Honour Mayanne Francis, the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, who will soon be ending her term. I want to thank her on behalf of the residents of Richmond County. I believe she made a number of visits to our county. One that I recall was she presented one of her Community Spirit Awards to the South Mountain Arm of Gold Association, which is located in the right along the Bredor Lakes, just outside the community of Dundee, and it's probably one of the more active organizations in Nova Scotia. Most of them are retired, but they continually put on activities on a regular basis, and I certainly was pleased to support their nomination, and I know they were extremely proud when Her Honour came to personally deliver the Community Spirit Award to the membership and the executive of the South Mountain Arm of Gold Association. So I again want to express my personal thanks and that on behalf of the residents of Richmond County for the dedication and commitment that she gave to her role as Lieutenant Governor of our province. Now, Mr. Speaker, I got confused a bit earlier about the last provincial election, but one thing that I recall very fondly was an anniversary which just recently passed. March 24th, 2012, a couple of important occasions. One, it's my father-in-law's birthday, but the other important milestone is that it was in March 24th, 1998, that I first had the privilege of being elected to represent the people of Richmond County. Speaker, 14 years has gone by very quickly, and I do want to recognize the remaining members of the class of 98. We're down to 8 members now. I am the only member from our caucus, but on the government side, the Premier, Deputy Premier, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Transportation, they almost all went to Cabinet, and then the member for Halifax-Shabukto, as well as the remaining members of the class of 1998. So I certainly want to extend my congratulations to them as well, because we were elected on the same date, and we went on to face our electorate on 4 other occasions, and the fact that we're here, and all of us, I have to say, made it through all 5 elections, because I shouldn't forget as well the member for Pictou West as well was a member of the class of 98, but he did take a bit of a sabbatical at one point. He wanted to focus on a few other things, but he did come back to the chamber, and that often happens when you have 5 elections in 14 years. It certainly is not what we would say is the norm. But Mr. Speaker, it's when I look back at the March 24th, 1998 date, previous to me serving in Richmond, we had been represented for 10 years by Richie Mann, who had served as a very strong advocate for the people of Richmond County, and was a minister who held a number of important portfolios in the Savage government. And ironically, in the Savage government, he was also the House Leader for the Savage government. So I'm pleased to see that Richmond County has been able to continue the tradition of having their members serve as House Leaders, as this is my first session of having the privilege of serving as House Leader for the official opposition. And in saying so, I certainly want to recognize my colleague, the member for Cape Breton South, who has been House Leader for our caucus since 1997. So even before I got elected, he was a House Leader under Premier Russell McClellan, and he remained our House Leader right up till very recently when I was named to the post. In 1998, it was, I believe, January, Mr. Speaker, when Richie Mann announced that he would not be reoffering after 10 years of service to the people of Richmond County as their MLA, and thus became the debate of who should run for the Liberal nomination. And at the time, Mr. Speaker, I was completing my articles after graduating from law school with a law firm here in Halifax, Blois, Nickerson and Bryson. And after an evening of lively discussion with friends and going through a period of elimination, it suddenly showed up to me and said, well, why don't you run? Which at the time I laughed, being 25 years of age and doing my articling. I certainly did not see that as an opportune time to be running for elected office. But Speaker, it's one of those things that when opportunity knocks, one should be very careful to close that door. So on March 1st, the election was called mid-February, and we had already set a date of March 1st for our nomination, knowing the election was March 24th. And we were 3 candidates running for the Liberal nomination, and there were 627 voting delegates on the first ballot. And I have to say, for a fairly small riding to get, that day it was well over 800 people were out, because the number had come just to see, knowing how many people there was going to be. And after the first ballot, I was 16 votes shy of taking it on the first ballot. So the third place candidate was dropped off, and we went to a second round. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, it was flu season. And a number of our supporters said, well, you know, he's come so close, he's obviously going to win it, so we're just going to go home rather than stand in line and vote again. And it made for a very interesting challenge of trying to find our largest supporters to block the doors and not let our people go before they went out and voted. Because one was not going to maintain the momentum of the first ballot if the first ballot supporters were not going to stay to vote again. So, Mr. Speaker, it was an exciting end to the day. I ended up winning on the second ballot by 36 votes. It was fairly close. And it made for an extremely exciting time, and the very next day we were off into the campaign because the campaign was already 2 weeks underway. If anyone thinks that was pretty close, the dates of March 1st to March 24th, only 23 days to campaign, my colleague over in Inverness, Charlie McDonald, only got nominated a week after me. So he was March 7th, or March 8th, I believe, to be nominated for a March 23rd election. And I'm happy to say that he won with a commanding victory in Inverness in the 1998 election. So, Mr. Speaker, those are very fond memories, and if someone had told me at that time that I would still be representing the people of Richmond County 14 years later, or more importantly, that in doing so I'd have to face 4 more elections in order to be able to achieve that, I'm not sure how many, whether myself or my other colleagues from the class of '98 would have been so eager to put our names on the ballot knowing what we were going to be faced with, because prior to that, elections were being held every 4 years, and in the case of the '98 election, it had been a full 5 years. And yet, here we were, we got elected in March 24th, 1998. The next election came in July 1999. Then the next election in July 2003. August 2003. August 5th. Some people remember that a bit more than I, because that would be when they may have arrived in this chamber. And after 2003, we had the election in 2006, which I believe was a summer election as well. That was a June election. So my colleagues from, you can tell who got elected in which year, in which election, just from who's giving the specific dates. And then we had the election, I believe they said earlier, it was June of 2009, which was the my last election. And I'm proud to say, Mr. Speaker, in my case, it was the election that I won with the largest majority in the face of... and that was in the face of a very clear orange tide going through the province. So I was certainly very humbled to see the level of support. And Richmond County is an area that certainly focused heavily on who their representative has been and has often voted against the government in choosing who was going to be their elected representative. And I was very humbled to have the opportunity to serve them again. And Mr. Speaker, after 14 years, you look back and some of the changes that have taken place, and when I speak of that nomination on March 1st, 1998, there were pictures taken of the crowd. And when I look back now and sit back and look at some of those pictures, it just amazes me to see how many of those faces are no longer with us. And if I look in Richmond County, the amount of what I've done over the years, Mr. Speaker, is when someone passes away, I send a handwritten card to their spouse, their children, brothers and sisters. I haven't kept track, but I believe most of the cards are ordered here from the legislature, but I would dare say that we're well into the thousands. And that's unfortunate, because we've lost a lot of good men and women in Richmond County during those 14 years. Both family, friends, supporters, opponents, people who ran against me for elected office that are no longer here. And it's difficult when you think of all those who've passed on in that time, some of the friendships that were formed, and the changes that take place over time with elected office. And Mr. Speaker, I as well wanted to extend my deepest sympathy on, I know in the throne speech it refers to notable Nova Scotians who've passed away. Some I knew, but others were names I certainly was aware of, but I as well want to echo my sympathy to the family of Senator Fred Dixon. I know that the leader of the Conservative Party read a resolution this evening recognizing his passing and his many accomplishments, and I had the opportunity to meet with him a number of times, especially on the energy file. I know he had certainly a vast interest in mining development in Cape Breton and the potential for a number of projects there, and I had the opportunity to discuss that with him at length. But I can tell you he's certainly someone that I would have appreciated the opportunity to hear more about his experiences when he was 25 and 30 and 40, and the workings of someone who was very close to the government of the day, the Buchanan government, and the work that he did as a strategist, as a supporter. I certainly would have enjoyed hearing his stories because obviously they were stories of success considering the amount of majority governments that the Buchanan government was able to achieve. For us as a Liberal caucus, it's with great sadness that we as well, since the last speech from the throne, saw the loss of Richie Hubbard, who was a well-respected, well-liked, friendly individual who served the people of Yarmouth here in this legislature, and Richie continued even after being in elected office to be a very active member of our party, a well-respected member of our party, he along with his wife, and certainly it was his wife Barb, and it was certainly a loss for us when Richie passed on. As well, Mr. Speaker, we lost another success story both in business and in elected life with the passing of Harold Huskelson, who served here for many years as the MLA for Shelburne, also served in the cabinet of Premier Gerald Regan, as well as being a very successful businessman in his own right. And I believe it's quite rare in Nova Scotia politics that we've seen a father be able to hand over the reins to his son, not only in business, but as well in elected office, because it was his son, Clifford, that replaced him in elected office as the MLA for Shelburne, and Clifford has taken over the family business as well. So we certainly want to, I and our entire caucus want to extend our deepest sympathies to the family of Harold Huskelson, and as well to the many residents of Shelburne County which he worked for and which would have supported him during his lengthy time in office. Mr. Speaker, I as well want to express both my shock and sympathy to the family of former Deputy Minister Peter Underwood. I did have the opportunity to work with Peter on a number of files affecting my constituents. I always found him to be a very knowledgeable individual, a very pleasant individual to approach, someone I'd often see walking on the street from our office here, the Bank of Montreal building. He worked in the same building for a period of time and held a number of portfolios as Deputy Minister. And certainly the news of his passing came as a shock, considering his age and everything else. So certainly to his family, our deepest sympathy and certainly our thanks for someone who clearly dedicated almost all of his working life to the service of the people of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to take the opportunity to look at a few of the items that are raised in the throne speech, and as well a number of the items that are not raised in the throne speech that was read by Your Honour. First, I'd be remiss if I didn't say again my disappointment, because having been elected for 14 years, I've heard a number of throne speeches, and prior to this government, I've never heard a throne speech delivered by Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia that had any political references in it. Never. Never. And this is not the first time, because it's happened before, that this government has chosen to use the throne speech, which is read by what's considered to be the head of state for Nova Scotia, the Queen's representative, and to make political references in that speech. I find it extremely unfortunate because as the Lieutenant Governor, she really has no ability to refuse to read a speech or refuse to read the contents. And there's a part in the very early in the speech where it makes reference to the previous administration. Now, this is not year 1 of this government. It's not year 2. It's year 3. And to take the 4th throne speech to again be making a political cheap shot at the previous government, I find it's very unfortunate, because when you look at the pomp and ceremony that goes along with a speech from the throne, you would expect that the government is going to show respect to our head of state and leave out those types of comments, because we cannot challenge the Lieutenant Governor on what she is saying, and nor can she defend herself in what she is reading. So I find it extremely distasteful that the government would have chosen the throne speech to make that type of political shot, whether it be at our caucus, whether it be at the other caucus. It's simply inappropriate. And I can tell you, in my 14 years, I haven't seen it done until the election of the NDP. It goes on a bit further into the speech, where I find it gets even worse when it's talking about energy development and the cost of energy, when it quotes those that would curse the darkness rather than light a candle. You know, Mr. Speaker, why would you put that in a speech read by Lieutenant Governor when you look at the ceremony that took place in that? Who would put that in there and find that that's not distasteful? I would certainly hope, if this government is going to do another speech from the throne, that they would show more respect to the head of state here in our province. Mr. Speaker, we all know there are lots of opportunities in our chamber if we want to speak about politics and speak about previous governments or speak about the current government. We're elected officials and we have lots of opportunities to make statements and to defend them. But to ask Lieutenant Governor to sit there and read political statements was completely inappropriate. But, Mr. Speaker, that would not be the only thing that I would deem to be inappropriate, because when one looks at the unprecedented amount of taxpayers' dollars that are currently being used by this government for politically motivated advertising, I would again say it completely inappropriate. Because when they sat on this side of the House, they criticized the previous government of John Hamm and the previous government of Rodney MacDonald for what they termed to be political-type advertising. So one can say that the ads for jobs here are not politically motivated. The ads for better care sooner might not be politically motivated. The ads for 811 might not be politically motivated. But you would have seen, Mr. Speaker, a number of signs popping up at different areas around the province. And what do those say? Well, last election we know that the NDP campaigned on, their slogan was, a better plan for Nova Scotia families. So we are now seeing signs that say, making life better for today's families. Now, we are asking public servants, paid for by taxpayers, to put these types of slogans on literature, to have signs printed, and asking public servants to go erect those signs. Now, if that is not political advertising, what is it? And it's very much similar to what the Harper government has been doing. Yet, if you look back at the criticisms that were made by this government when they sat in opposition, you would clearly see how their actions today are inappropriate. And I don't see how any independent person could look at the political slogan of a better deal for today's families and then look at a government slogan of saying making life better for families is not the same. But to show you how, and this is where too often a government in its rush to try to take credit for everything they do and try to make Nova Scotians feel at a time when they're cutting education, at a time where they're cutting health, at a time where they're firing mental health, addiction workers, they want the public to look somewhere else. So lo and behold, walking out the Bank of Montreal building here on George Street in downtown Halifax, what do you look at? You look at staging across the road that's around the Dominion building, which is part of the Art Gallery of Nova Scotia. And here's the big sign that taxpayers paid for,
that a civil servant was asked to draw up, do the design work, print it, and then someone had to go climb the scaffolding to erect this sign. And what does it say? Making life better for families. It has the Premier's name on it, the Minister of Community, Culture and Heritage, and what does it say on the bottom? Exterior renovations, sandstone to the Dominion building. Now, if anyone can explain to me how that makes life better for families, well, I'd be curious to hear which member of the government side can justify that. If that is not political advertising at its worst, what is? Because, Mr. Speaker, when a constituent comes in to me and says, I can't pay my power bill,
Not saying much over there.
can I show them that sign to say, well, don't complain about not being able to pay your power bill, because look what the government's doing. They're fixing the exterior of the Dominion building, and that's making life better for you, according to this government. And when they come in and say, I can't pay my rent because community services has not kept up with inflation and the cost of living is going up, I can show them that sign. I've taken a picture of it, so I can have it and say, well, no. Everything's fine because they're fixing the exterior of Dominion building in downtown Halifax, which is making life better for you under this government. Mr. Speaker, when a mother comes in and says, I can no longer take my children to all their sporting activities because of the price of gas, I will again be able to say, and show them the picture and say, relax, because the government's fixing the exterior of the Dominion building in downtown Halifax, which is making life better for your family. That's great. Now, Mr. Speaker, if that is not proof of a government that is out of touch with the needs of everyday Nova Scotians, I don't know what is. Mr. Speaker, and the reason why is because the NDP as a party, as I said before, it spent its entire existence in opposition. It always said it was the one party of principle. Liberals and Tories went all over the place, but they were the party of principle. They were the party of putting people first. Or can we even say a better deal for today's families? Yet, Mr. Speaker, what I can tell you now, and what I've said to the media when they've asked me, is that this government has but one focus now. It's not on families, it's not on seniors, it's not on students, it's not on children with mental health addictions. It's on one thing and one thing only: winning the next election. That is the only priority that this government has right now. And it's become obvious. Because how else would a premier be able to say, put my name on a sign on the Dominion building in downtown Halifax that's getting its exterior fixed, and I want you to put the slogan that this is making life better for families. And I hope the premier will stand in his place and explain to Nova Scotians how that is making life better for their families. Mr. Speaker, well, I'm afraid, Mr. Premier, you're going to have to listen for a little bit longer, because I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there's about 35 minutes left. If the Speaker wishes to correct that, so it might be a little bit. So, Mr. Speaker, our leader mentioned it when we go back to the throne speech, and just to show you the irony of how the government is, look over here. To hear them talk in their throne speech about the success of Michelin here in Nova Scotia, the irony of that, if I could even say the unmitigated gall of them to put that in the throne speech and try to say somehow that they're responsible for that, or that they truly value that. Because, Mr. Speaker, it was just last fall that for the first time in my 14 years, never before, and in that 14 years, almost all of those years was spent sitting on the Law Amendments Committee, I never saw anyone from Michelin appear at the Nova Scotia House of Assembly. Yet it took an NDP government with its labor-friendly law, anti-business law agenda to bring Michelin here and to speak in some of the strongest language I've ever seen presenters give. Because it came down to a question of credibility. Because when the Premier initially met with Michelin, it was reported that they had used very strong language with him and said that future investments were in doubt. Our leader put the question to the Premier here in this House. Hansard will show that. And the Premier stood there and said no such thing was said. Nothing at all. An exaggeration by the media, exaggeration by the leader of the official opposition. No such thing was said. Now, I wasn't at that meeting, Mr. Speaker. I don't think you were either. The Premier was there. Representatives from Michelin were there. So at that point, we were left with the Premier's version of events. We had no other way of knowing what was said, what was the tone of the discussion. Whatever the Premier reported, that's what we had to go with. But when Michelin came to Law Amendments Committee and made their presentation, they were fairly strong in their presentation. But I had the opportunity to ask supplementary questions after their presentation. And I asked the gentleman that was there very specifically, when you met with the Premier, did you indicate anything about the impact of this legislation? And he very clearly said, we informed the Premier that passage of this type of legislation would call into question any future investment in Michelin's 3 facilities in Nova Scotia. Wow. Mr. Speaker, exactly what our leader questioned the Premier on. So at the time, we're left with, who do we believe? Do we believe the Premier, who says no such thing was said? Or do we believe this individual who's come in, who has, to our knowledge, no political agenda other than trying to ensure the best interests of his company and certainly his interest in Nova Scotia based on his presentation, his commitment to the company here in our province? So why is it that when it was first reported, the Premier wouldn't have simply acknowledged that? Because if there's one company in Nova Scotia which has received significant attention, it has its own legislation, it's Michelin. But how ironic as well, not only their discussions with the Premier, but if I'm not mistaken, all 3 of their facilities are located in government-held ridings. And yet, here was a company that in my 14 years never appeared in front of this legislature, never saw legislation which caused it concern that it would lead it to come down here, and yet for this bill, they came and they gave that message. And we heard it from Sobeys, another company that I don't believe I had ever seen come before Law Amendments, and Clearwater, and some of our largest employers. And so here we are now, after hearing that, and yet in the speech from the throne, anyone who didn't know about Bill 102 and first contract arbitration might say, what a wonderful relationship this government has with Michelin, and they're celebrating their success. But that's the gall that this government has of trying to make Nova Scotians forget what has really happened, the changes that they have made, and where that was another example of where, on the order of priority, do you support a strong business climate that's been working, or do you reward your friends in the labor movement that have given your political party millions of dollars over the years? I think Nova Scotians can draw their own conclusions. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that's mentioned in the speech from the throne, which I have to say as a representative from Cape Breton, drew my attention, was this reference to a Cape Breton Strategic Framework Advancement Project.
What the heck's that?
Now, I wouldn't want to try to say that one 3 times fast, but, you know, what is that? And what does it tell us in the speech from the throne? It says that we'll tap into the amazing potential the island holds. Well, so I guess we have to wait and see what this means, because, Mr. Speaker, as a member for Cape Breton, that's the first time I hear of any such reference of this. Is it something for the economy? When it talks about potential, is it tourism? Is it mineral development? Is it that possible NASA landing station that they talked about before? Which one is it? Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the people of Cape Breton are getting tired of strategies, and they're getting tired of projects. They really are. Because right now, in my riding, which I'm sure is the same thing for Inverness and ridings throughout Cape Breton, people are extremely worried. Because it doesn't take long to look around and to see there's many more seniors than there are young people in Cape Breton, in communities throughout. One of the things that I'm disappointed that's not mentioned in this speech from the throne is any sort of specific economic development plan for communities such as the Strait, with the New Page Mill being closed, or even for the South Shore with the uncertainty that exists at the Bowater pulp mill. There is no reference at all. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, the days when the NDP were in opposition, if any speech from the throne didn't mention Cape Breton or specific initiatives, we certainly heard about it. Yet, if the people in the Strait area are saying, what is there in the speech from the throne that gives us hope? What is there for over half the workforce, almost 300 tradespeople that will not have a job once the mill reopens, which we're all hoping will be sooner rather than later? They've already been told only half the workforce will be required. What is in this plan for all those workers and their families? Mr. Speaker, what is in the speech from the throne to talk about the pensions at New Page and the significant deficiency that exists in those pensions? Mr. Speaker, I can tell you, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this, it's a bit different in your riding than mine, but in Richmond County, other than teachers and a couple of civil servants, the only people with private pension plans were the workers of Stora and New Page. That was it. I would say 70% of my retirees are probably drawing the supplementary, which is just bringing them to a basic level of income. Canada pension, old age, supplementary. Maybe 30% had private pension plans. Of that 30%, they're either teachers or they're employees of Stora and later New Page. If those pension plans are going to cut benefits by the amounts that have been suggested, that is going to be an extremely difficult blow to the economy of the Strait area. Because the fact that we have so many seniors living in our community, if their income is reduced, it affects the entire economy. At this point, we're still in wait-and-see mode. And I know many of the pensioners, especially those who retired in the last year or so, who made decisions of their retirement and made decisions on investments and on expenses they incurred based on what their pension would be once they were done work. Now to be suggested that that could be reduced by 30%, possibly 40%, that is going to cause truly economic hardship. So one cannot just talk about the potential job losses even when the new operator reaches agreement to be able to resume operations. It's not only those job losses, which we know of, but it's certainly going to be the significant impact that any reductions are going to take place in those pensions and the impact on both the workers, their spouses, or their widows and their families. Mr. Speaker, what was interesting as well is this government's desire to have strategies for everything. Again, when you're into year 3, one would suspect the government has a bit of a sense of where they're going to go and how they're going to get there. Yet, just a few that I noted in looking quickly through the speech from the throne is the international commerce strategy. There's one. Then we're going to have a commercial fisheries strategy. And then we're going to have an aquaculture strategy. Now, Mr. Speaker, it certainly begs the question of where are we at with these strategies, especially when you look at aquaculture and you look at the seafood industry, which I'm sure the Minister knows is one of our most significant exports we have in this province. And yet we're talking about strategies. We're talking about strategies. What have we been doing this whole time that we're talking about strategies? And Mr. Speaker, I did have the opportunity to attend the International Boston Seafood Show with the Minister and with a number of companies from Nova Scotia. And while it's always impressive to see where our industry is in our province, it's also quite obvious that we are behind other provinces in their development of aquaculture, in their development of secondary processing. And that's an issue which I have been talking about for years, not only with this government, with the previous administration as well, and even in our time in government, was how do we find ways of doing that value-added processing whether it's with mussels, whether it's with scallops, whether it's with lobster, crab, shrimp, everything you can think of. Because we need to find new creative ways. Because when you look at our lobster fishery and our crab fishery as examples, they are fished in a very sustainable fashion. And sustainability is a big issue today. More and more consumers are being concerned about how their food has ended up in front of them. You know, the whole idea of stuff being dragged is something that's going to be very difficult for that industry because of these new sustainability measures. But we have something that we can brag about here in Nova Scotia. Lobsters enter a lobster pot willingly. No one has forced them. They do so, they're not under duress. No one is chasing them. They have the opportunity to go and enter it on their own. Probably not the wisest decision that they'll make in their life, but they do so willingly. Crab is the same thing. They enter a pot on their own. They are not forced, they're not chased, they're not damaged. They go into these traps willingly. And that's a big part of sustainability, and that's something that people want to see. And I know, for example, our swordfish industry wants to receive the sustainability certification as well. And last year during estimates, we did raise the matter with the minister, and I know he indicated some monies had gone towards that, which I would say is a good investment on our part. So, Mr. Speaker, as we're talking strategies, let's not forget that there's immediate needs here in this province. We all collectively need to find ways to grow our economy. The offshore, the current project, is going dry. Those revenues are going to continue to decrease. The demands for services from government will continue to increase. The only way to deal with that is going to be with increased revenue. And what are we doing as a province to have more revenue here? If one looks at aquaculture, for example, New Brunswick is almost 4 times more value than where we're at here in Nova Scotia. BC is ahead of everybody else in Canada, almost everybody combined. So there's tremendous opportunities there for us to continue to work, and I'm certainly hoping we're not going to get bogged down in strategies rather than finding real solutions that are going to be able to grow the economy, because while the Minister of Finance has told us user fees are not going up this year, you know, we have to find ways other than continually taxing Nova Scotians. Because it was interesting, because I know it's been quoted in the House before when the Minister of Finance was in opposition. He felt that the use of increasing user fees was a stealth tax. I believe that was his words. Even more reprehensible, and we agreed with him, was that increasing user fees were being done outside the budgetary process and outside of the legislature. The Minister of Finance could just send an announcement out. He didn't have to face the elected members of the legislature, didn't have to try to get legislation passed to that effect, could do it just like that. And yet when he had the opportunity as Minister of Finance to do things differently, to say, I'm going to put it in my budget, or I'm going to bring in a piece of legislation, and I'm going to allow Nova Scotians elected members to be able to discuss this, I'm going to allow our ministers to justify the increases in user fees of their own departments, it didn't happen. And it was interesting, Mr. Speaker, it was almost amusing, I must say, because one of the questions went to the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, about an increase, one of the user fees, I believe it was some type of a permit, that had increased by almost $400. And the question to him was, what has changed in the delivery of that permit to justify such an increase? And the first question he tried to answer it, and by the final supplementary, he said, I don't know, ask the Minister of Finance, it was his decision to do it. And then we all remember how the Minister of Finance says, no, I don't make any decisions about increases in fees or increases in income or increases in taxes. I'm the Minister of Finance, but I have nothing to do with that, which is laughable, to say the least, Mr. Speaker, but it's already part of the political cover that the Minister of Finance is trying to establish for himself in some of the unpopular decisions being made by the government. Because if there's no increase this year, one has to question, was last year a double increase? Was it a 2-year increase so that they wouldn't have to do it in year 2 and somehow tell Nova Scotians, look, you know, we're a kind and compassionate government, we're not going to increase user fees this year. as we get into the budgetary process, we may have the opportunity to ask that, because as the Minister of Finance would have said in opposition, our user fee should be based on the cost of delivering a service. And if a government cannot justify the cost of delivering the service, it becomes a tax. And I believe that he will now, if he's going to be honest with himself, he would say it is in essence a tax. And the fact that it was done without representation, without the ability of elected members in this House to be able to debate the issue on behalf of our constituents, makes it that much more reprehensible to not only do the increase, but to not come before the elected members of the House to justify it. Now, the Minister of Finance has a couple of opportunities to do that. He's chosen not to, but here we get to the end of the agreement of the Imperial Oil bill that I was here in this House when that was debated, where the former Conservative government had agreed that they would cap the assessment on that facility, meaning that they would not pay to Halifax Regional Municipality the amount of taxes that would be based on their normal assessment. And it was an interesting discussion because the Conservatives were clearly for it. They brought in legislation. Our caucus made it very clear we were against it. We didn't think Nova Scotia taxpayers should be funding big oil at a time, especially when people were concerned here in the city about taxes going up, cost of services going up, and that this was potential revenue that the city would be losing because the province was sticking its nose basically in their affairs and dictating how Imperial Oil was going to pay its taxes. What was interesting is the positions were clear between the Conservative government and the Liberal opposition. What wasn't clear was where were the NDP? Where were the official opposition? And so what's interesting in our democracy and here in the legislature, Mr. Speaker, that when you're not sure where a political party is on a bill and you want to have a better indication of where they are, you call for a recorded vote. And that's what happened on that bill. And it was interesting because with a recorded vote, the way it goes, that it does the government side first, which clearly was all in favor, and then it comes to the official opposition. It starts over closest to the Speaker. So what was interesting was that the first member, well, if I'm not mistaken, it might have been the member for Pictou West at the time, but I can't be sure. First member got up, Dartmouth East, was member for Dartmouth East. He got up, and he said, she got up. That was Don Chard, but anyways, Joan Mass, that's right, Don Chard was before that. She got up and said no. Then the next member of the NDP said no, and they kept saying no. The Premier himself, as leader of official opposition, said no, and then it got to the official opposition House Leader, Mr. Kevin DeVoe, Cole Harbour, Eastern Passage, and he said yes. And then it went to the Liberal side. We all said no, as we had publicly said. We didn't support the legislation. As it went to the official opposition, second row, third row, everybody said no, except the official opposition House Leader. But one thing I can say, Mr. Speaker, is that the Conservative government of the day brought that bill here before the House. And we had a lively debate. We had a debate which Nova Scotians were engaged in, which Nova Scotians were calling their elected members and saying, here's my position, or here's my concern, here's what I suggest. And that's how democracy should work. So now, that 5-year agreement expires. So the government has two choices. One, they can say, you know what, this is an issue that obviously we were split on before. We don't want to go down that road again, so instead, we'll just renew it at the cabinet table, and it'll never have to go before the people of Nova Scotia. Or option number 2 would have been to say, we'll bring in another bill to basically renew the agreement, but in doing so, we will allow all elected members of the legislature on all sides. There might even be some government members who aren't fussy about seeing taxpayers' dollars going to give a break to big oil. I would have to think there's a number of supporters in the NDP party that probably are not overly fussy about seeing tax breaks being given to Imperial Oil at a time when we're paying over $1.40 a litre for unleaded gas. But Mr. Speaker, that's when it comes to a question of are you there to do what's right, or are you there to try to win the next election? And there's but one more example where this government took the easy road and said, we'll renew it in cabinet, we'll put out a press release. When the Premier was asked, how do you explain that you voted against it when you're in opposition, and yet now when you have an opportunity as Premier to make your mark on this agreement, you allow it to get renewed in cabinet? And the Premier's weak response was, well, the price of gas is higher today. Really? That's the best that he could give? Because during the debate, they almost remained silent. And it was clear there was division. And the Minister of Finance, when he would have been sitting here, he voted no as well. Only the member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage voted yes. Yet now, rather than stand in the House and say, we're prepared to bring in legislation and explain to Nova Scotians our flip-flop on this issue and the reasons behind it, instead, they'd rather stay hidden in the cabinet room and make the unpopular decisions there rather than allow the elected members of this House to have a full and open debate on these types of issues. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians deserve better. Nova Scotians thought they were going to get better. And Mr. Speaker, instead, what we see now is a party that's no longer there to stand on the principles which they talked about for years, but is there to try to win the next election. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have an opportunity to see this province move forward. There are challenging times. There are opportunities. But we're either going to have those open discussions here in this legislature and work together, or that's not going to, we're going to miss out on some of those opportunities. Yeah. You know, Mr. Speaker, and I have to reiterate again, the situation in the Strait area is a dire one. It's one that's caused great level of concern. And I certainly made the offer right from the start and the suggestion that the 4 members for the Strait area, myself, the member for Inverness, the member for Antigonish on the government side, the member for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour, should be kept informed of what was going on. This Mills Committee that the government has formed should involve the participation of the 4 members from the Strait. You know, 2 from the government, 1 from each opposition party. Because, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, the residents in my riding, and I'm sure in the riding of Guysborough, Sheet Harbour, and in Inverness and Antigonish, aren't calling the Mills Committee for status updates. They're calling us, and they're saying, what's going on? What is the state of the negotiations? What are we looking at? Is there anything that can be done for these pensions? The 4 of us met with the management retirees. And at that time, they expressed their significant disappointment that the Premier had not responded to their requests to meet with them. Now, I will acknowledge that the last time he was in the Strait area, this request went in, I believe they indicated at the end of November 2011, and when we met with them in February, they had not received a response or any indication that the Premier would be willing to meet with them. Yet he did, I will acknowledge that he did meet with them when he was down the last time, but again, I'm not sure if the member for Antigonish was there or if the member for Guysborough Sheet Harbour was part of that meeting, but I can tell you I wasn't, and I don't believe the member for Inverness was. And we should have been there, Madam Speaker, because we're the ones who will get the phone calls. We're the ones that our residents will be looking to give them answers and give them assurances. What is the status of the negotiations for a new power agreement? What is the status of negotiations with the Department of Natural Resources for wood supply? What is the status of discussions with the union, which we understand is now going on? Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I don't suspect that the Premier or his Mills Committee would be able to divulge all of the information to us. But to even be able to tell the elected officials in the Strait as much information as possible, knowing that we can then pass it on to our constituents who are extremely worried, I find it unfortunate that the Premier and his government chose not to take up that opportunity. And I have to say, Madam Speaker, that as frustrating as it is, when you're in opposition, you almost have to accept that's unfortunately what often happens with a majority government. But I have to say, I found it disappointing, almost bordering on sad, that when we met with the pension group, the government members from Antigonish and Guysborough Sheet Harbour clearly had no more information than we had. So for us, it's easy to say we're the opposition, government's not going to share it with us, but as far as why they wouldn't share it, even with the government members, that I find was a little distasteful, to say the least, and unfortunate that they were not more aware of what their own government was doing through this Mills Committee. So, Madam Speaker, as I said, the speech from the throne clearly does not set out a specific economic plan to deal with the hundreds of tradespeople that are going to be left without work that formerly were at New Page. It does not address the trades, the skills and tradespeople that worked at the Bowater facility, which my understanding has been on repeated shutdowns, and therefore lack of work becoming a significant concern there as well. That is what we're hoping that we would see. If the government wanted another speech from the throne, its fourth in 3 years, we would have thought they would have at least had specific initiatives in this. Instead, that clearly did not happen, and as a result, Madam Speaker, I can assure you that we will continue to do our best to hold this government accountable for the decisions they make here in this legislature and the many, as I've indicated, that they make in the cabinet room and away from the elected House of Representatives here in Nova Scotia. Madame la Présidente, vous me permettrez juste quelques minutes pour souligner à tous les électeurs, les résidents du comté de Richmond, mes remerciements. Comme j'ai dit au début, le 24 mars 2012, ça marquait l'anniversaire de la 14e anniversaire de ma première élection comme le député de Richmond. Madame la Présidente, ça me semble, c'était juste hier que je me rappelle la campagne. Une journée, il faisait beau soleil, il faisait chaud. Prochaine journée, il y avait de la neige. Prochaine journée, c'était trempe. Alors, à la fin, j'avais décidé de porter qu'on dirait des steel toe boots parce qu'il y avait si tas de vase, au bas de la neige, au bas il faisait froid. J'ai pensé que c'est ça qui était les meilleures choses de mettre sur mes souliers, sur mes pieds, je dois dire. Mais je peux vous dire, Madame la Présidente, que j'ai tellement aimé les derniers 14 ans. Je suis un avocat et puis je dis souvent que ça que j'aime si tant de la profession d'être député élu, c'est que je peux faire du travail, je peux être porte-parole, je peux être en essence un avocat pour les gens que je représente, mais à la fin de la journée, je n'ai pas besoin de leur envoyer une facture. C'est ça qui est la grande différence entre la vie d'un avocat privé et la vie d'un avocat qui se trouve dans la situation d'être un élu ici à la province. Je veux remercier tous les gens qui ont travaillé sur mes campagnes. Comme je l'ai dit plus tôt, ça fait 5 élections que j'ai fait face au côté de Richmond en 98, 99, 2003, 2006, 2009. Alors 5 élections de 14 ans, je pense que c'est assez d'élections dans ce bout de temps-là. Mais je peux vous dire que chaque fois, j'ai toujours aimé faire la campagne, aller visiter avec les gens à leur maison, dans leur cuisine, dans leur tambour, sur leur terrain, pour entendre qu'est-ce qui étaient leurs inquiétudes, qu'est-ce qui étaient leurs espoirs, qu'est-ce qu'ils s'attendaient de leurs représentants. Et puis, je peux vous dire que j'étais très fier que mes dernières élections, qui s'est trouvé un moment qu'on avait une mer orange qui passait à travers de la province avec la majorité qui a été réalisée par le parti NPD, de voir que j'ai pu gagner avec ma plus grosse majorité les dernières élections chez nous au comté de Richmond. Et puis, en même temps, on aura l'occasion durant cette session de parler un peu plus du futur de notre circonscription et les circonscriptions de quelqu'un de mes collègues. Mais, Madame la Présidente, c'est une circonscription qui a un riche héritage, qui a si tant de différentes cultures, qui est représentée, la fierté qui est là dans la communauté. c'est l'ancien député de Richmond, Jerry Doucette, qui est un député conservateur, qui avait écrit ses mémoires. Il avait dit que dans ses hautes années comme député, il avait eu l'occasion de parler à des collègues qui représentaient des circonscriptions à travers la province. Puis il y avait, pour à lui, après d'entendre de tous ses collègues, il avait décidé que les gens de Richmond, c'était les gens qui demandaient le plus de leur député provincial que toutes les autres régions dans la province. Ben, je peux vous dire, après 14 ans, je n'ai rien que je peux dire contre la conclusion qui a été faite par M. Doucette sur ça. Mais en même temps, c'est une population de gens qui demandent beaucoup de leurs représentants, mais qui sont aussi des personnes qui te remercient, qui reconnaissent les demandes de la vie politique, qui reconnaissent les différents efforts qui ont été faits par leurs députés pour eux. Et à la fin de la journée, comme j'ai dit, Madame la Présidente, j'aurais jamais pensé que je serais ici pour 14 ans, 5 élections, mais c'était une expérience remarquable, une expérience que je suis très content que j'ai décidé de poursuivre. Et puis, je peux vous dire que j'ai hâte de voir encore quelques années ici à l'Assemblée et j'aurai encore l'occasion de parler un peu plus sur ce sujet et sur d'autres sujets pour les gens du comté de Richmond. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Pleasure to stand and maybe say a few words in regards to the speech from the throne that we heard a few days ago, and it's been a great opportunity to think about it over the weekend. First of all, I want to wish everybody a happy Easter, just in case I don't have the chance throughout this week to offer everybody a happy Easter and, of course, a happy Holy Week, because don't forget, it's not just about Easter. There's a whole bunch of other things that go on this week that, of course, commemorate and underline the sufferances or the souffrance of our Lord Jesus Christ. So I just want to make sure that everybody, of course, you know, if they haven't been to church in a while, maybe they should go. You know, we as politicians all need the help and faith that we could possibly get. And I do hope that, of course, everybody takes that opportunity during this Paschal season. Second of all, of course, after religion, there's also something that is very important, which is hockey. And I want to use this moment to publicly thank each and every person that had the opportunity to vote for Kraft Hockeyville. For those of you who maybe didn't know, Yarmouth was one of the top 5 locations vying for Kraft's Hockeyville. Of course, that came to fruition on Saturday night. Of course, this was put on by a local committee. By being, of course, one of the top 5, the community was able to raise $5,000 or win $5,000 from Kraft for upgrading the hockey rink and the Mariner Center that, of course, that we have in Yarmouth. But again, I want to thank the organizers, Wayne Hamilton, the owners of the TriStar Mariners, of all that community that came out and supported the activities, of course, that were on Saturday. A tremendous amount of time and fun was had by all at the Mariner Center. And we came out with 1.6 million votes for Yarmouth in supporting Yarmouth as being Kraft Hockeyville. Now, what does that mean? That means we came in 4th. Madam Speaker, that we came in 4th. Unfortunately, we didn't grasp that prize. And I want to congratulate Sterling Rodden. I believe they're in Ontario, who did win the Kraft Hockeyville, and they did it with somewhere close to 4 million votes. So you can only imagine how many times people would have to vote even to get to 1.6 in Nova Scotia. You know, that means everybody's going to have to vote almost twice, of course, for the population that we have here in Nova Scotia. But here you go with Kraft Hockeyville, which was, it gave us international, not necessarily international. It wasn't necessarily international, but of course across Canada, people knew who Yarmouth was. It gave that community a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, and something that they haven't felt in some time now. You know, and I'll get a little bit to maybe the concerns that we have in Yarmouth County and Southwest Nova Scotia a little later on. The other great part that happened that night was the hockey game itself, where there was a hockey game vying for the Bent Division finals in the Junior Hockey League. Yarmouth Mariners, of course, beat out the Amherst Ramblers, I believe, the Amherst Ramblers, I think that's what they're called. Beat them out in a phenomenal game. Apparently, it was just an absolutely phenomenal game. I unfortunately was too late in trying to buy tickets and was unable to buy a ticket. There was actually people, shame on them, on Facebook, trying to sell tickets to the game yesterday or on Saturday night for $500. So they should have been nice enough, if they can't make it, that they could have passed it on to someone else that could have participated in the fun of that evening. But they chose to go a little more. They only needed the money, maybe, I don't know, but it didn't seem fair at all. But that means the Yarmouth Mariners, you know, after all this excitement and all this, move on to the finals of the league, and we'll be up against the Woodstock Slammers. The Woodstock Slammers, of course, from New Brunswick. So we're hoping that, of course, Nova Scotia Pride does come forward on this one again, and that we do support them. And I hope everybody offers themselves, you know, whether it's a tweet or a Facebook or a note of encouragement to support the work of the Yarmouth TriStar Mariners as they vie for the cup of this year's Hockey League. Madam Speaker, of course, in my constituency, I do want to bring up a couple issues that have been going on, and this one, of course, is to the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal. Before I get into the meat of my speech tonight, as you know, I've been advocating for a new bridge for my constituency, which is, of course, the bridge that goes from the mainland to Surrett's Island. And I know that the minister and I have traded comments back and forth, whether in question period and other. And I, of course, want to thank the minister for his support on this one. And if you remember last year, there was an issue of an osprey. Okay, so on top of this bridge, as everybody was getting ready to review the bridge, do an engineering study, everything got shut down because an osprey sat on top of the bridge. And of course would dive bomb anybody that tried to visit the bridge, tried to measure the bridge, or anything like that. So last week or the week before, the Department of Transportation, with help from the Department of Natural Resources, so I'll thank the Minister of Natural Resources for the support from his department on this one, to move the nest for the osprey. So we go from the top of the span, of the middle span of the bridge, to another location. As I think many of you have seen, I believe it's Nova Scotia Power sort of sets up these poles with these boxes on top that everybody can move either an osprey nest or an eagle's nest or whatever it is. So they set one up. I got pictures. If anybody wants to see them, I can show them later on. But the funny part is today, what happens, the osprey's around. So the osprey came back from wherever it goes during the winter, which is probably smarter than most of us, goes down south, somewhere's warm, and tried to start setting up his nest again on top of the bridge. So all this work, I think, was for naught, of setting up this new pole, of getting the thing moved over. So my request in this medium to the Minister of DNR, maybe the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, if there's anything we can do to make sure the osprey moves to the other location, would be good, so work can commence on that bridge without disturbing, of course, that bridge and that bird, because of course, you know, we don't want to be disturbing these birds too much. So of course, that's important in my constituency, and the people of Surrett's Island are a little worried that maybe their bridge might get a little more delayed because of the appearance of the osprey, but we'll see how it goes in a number of days, and of course I thank the ministers for any input or any help that they might be able to give on this issue in my constituency. The member for Richmond, of course, took an opportunity to talk about some of the people that have not been able to follow along throughout the years as they've passed away, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, and where we've lost a lot of our friends. And I do want to underline particularly one individual from my constituency, and maybe someone else after this too as well. But I want to just bring the issue of Michel d'Entremont up. Michel Alain is what we would call him, or Michel Mariella. Mariella is his wife. Michel was about 67 years old, I believe is what it said on the obituary. And Michel had been fighting cancer for probably close to 15 years. And as we would go to the walks and to the organizations and to the different things that would go on in support of cancer research, of course Michel would be there wearing his yellow shirt. And knowing the things that guy went through and how tough he was, I just want to thank him. I know he's not with us today, but I want to thank him for the work he did in providing support to other families. Even though he was going through his own issues, he always was able to support and lend a hand to others who were stepping up to the fight to cancer. And Michel, of course, did it with class. He did it with absolute tons of heart. And I do want to thank him and, of course, Mariella, because Mariella, I got to say, is a phenomenal spouse and support for Michel, and, of course, for the whole community as well, because always by Michel's side, of course, was Mariella, helping him along and being the best booster that a husband could ever have. So I just wanted to just mention Michel quickly today. And of course, thank all of his family and give, of course, this House of Assembly's condolences to them and all the friends of Michel d'Entremont. He will be definitely missed, and I do hope that through his souffrance that some good will come of it. That we'll continue to support the Canadian Cancer Society. That will continue to support different activities that are happening to find a cure for this disease. And I just wanted to mention that. The other person, of course, and I know the member for Richmond did mention him, was, of course, Peter Underwood. And Peter and I, had a bit of a bond because Peter was my first deputy minister. So here was a newly minted MLA back in 2003, August 5th of 2003, and was put into cabinet not knowing exactly what goes on in agriculture or what was going on in the Department of Fisheries. At the time, there were combined departments. The deputy was Peter Underwood. And Peter did a phenomenal job in, of course, supporting those organizations, to be able to support those industries as they were so important in Nova Scotia, but also that the personal help that he gave me as I was learning about those departments. And I know many of the ministers could vouch for this as they became ministers and looked at the piles of briefing books and had all the briefings done, sort of like drinking from a fire hose. And Peter did it with extreme class as well. And to see the work that he did as he moved on to Department of Natural Resources and then into central government, and the support that I know that he gave this government as well. In getting things set up and getting things moved as you gave him some difficult issues to deal with. Peter and his family, of course, I want to wish them and give them my sincere condolences as well. And I know we'll, every time one of us gets up to speak over the next bit, we'll probably all have our own story of someone that, just didn't make it long enough to be here. And I think have all provided us with some kind of support or have impacted our lives in one way or another. And those are the two gentlemen that I did want to speak about today. I did also want to say that as a member of the class of August 5th, 2003, and there's maybe more of us than there is of the class of 1998 or 1999, but I think, a lot of us are still here working hard for our constituents. And I do want to thank the constituents of the beautiful constituency of Argyll for the beautiful communities that are held within it. And thank them not only for, winning in August 5th, 2003, thank goodness that happened, but for the majorities that they gave me following that. In 2006, I was able to pull about 67% of the vote. In 2009, in the Orange Crush that we would call it, you know, I was able to pull off 64% of the vote. So continue to stay in that really good realm. So to me, I hope that I'm doing the right thing for the constituents of Argyll, and I think in the last 2 elections showed that I must be in the right place because they did give me their support. You know, Argyll is a phenomenally diverse place. Whether you're down by the ocean in the Pubnicos, watching the hundreds of lobster boats coming in and out, or whether you're on a skidder in the woods of East Kemp, or whether you're watching the hundreds of boats leaving Wedgeport, etc. You know, our constituency is made up of a whole bunch of points, all different in respect to their identities and to their cultures. Argyll, even though it is an English word, of course, represents the second largest Acadian constituency in Nova Scotia. And through those communities, as you weave in and out of those points, we all have, like I said, a different culture, a different identity. We have a different way of speaking. We have a different accent. And I know the member for Richmond, the member for Clare could vouch for that. You know, my accent when I speak French is not necessarily one of Argyll. It's one of Middle West Pubnico. And I tell you, the people from Lower West Pubnico speak differently than Middle West. The Wedgeports, of course, speak way different. The ones in Surrett's Island, the ones in Quinnen, the ones in East Pubnico. And it reminds me of a quick, and I want people to, if they have an access to YouTube, that they take the opportunity to search about the patois or the accent that they have in Shediac. They call it the Shiak, is what they call it. And I think, I'm just trying to remember how to spell that, but anyway, if you do Shediac, speaking Shiak, you'll find a little video which is really interesting, and there's one line in it that reminds me of people from East Pubnico, because they're probably, because of their connection to the region of Shelburne as you head towards the Woods Harbors and those areas. So they're probably the area that's starting to be assimilated more than other areas. And in that YouTube video, the line is "J'ai crossé la street." You know, I crossed the road. J'ai crossé la street, which is a very indicative of what's happening in our constituencies and happening in those communities. And what we say of the people in East Pubnico, they would say, "J'ai tiré la balle over la fence." How many people got that? I'm sure everybody got that one. So you know, what we need to do is work even harder to make sure that those lines are drawn, to make sure that assimilation doesn't continue to happen, because little by little, that will continue to happen in all of our communities. You know, I look at Richmond, and Lardois is what we would call it. Lardways is what everybody else should call it. Sorry to the member for Cape Breton, Prague West, because of course Lardways is sort of getting closer to his constituency as it goes into the St. Peters and those areas. We have very diverse, interesting communities. And the thing I wanted to quickly say about that is that these constituencies are threatened, and we will talk about this as we go forward. But it really looks like through the new Boundary Commission that I might be the last MLA for Argyll. It might belong to another constituency. You know, luckily, if it does get built into a different community, well, you know, God willing, that I'm able to represent that new constituency. But to be the last MLA of an area makes my heart hurt just a little bit, because I think we all worked really hard in presenting the issues of assimilation in this House of Assembly, and it really went to show that through a process that the NDP majority committee didn't understand that, doesn't understand what it is to be in a community that is threatened by assimilation every day, and what the importance of not only having a last name that is Acadian, but having also the opportunity to speak French, the opportunity to understand and live in those communities. And I'm going